Hello everyone and welcome to Delaware Debates 2024. I'm Ralph Begleiter on behalf of the Delaware Public Media and the University of Delaware Center for Political Communication. Glad to have you all here. Delaware Debates is supported by the University of Delaware's College of Arts and Sciences and the Department of Communication. For this debate, we invited candidates in the race for one of Delaware's seats in the United States Senate. The Republican nominee for U.S. Senate is Eric Hansen, here with us tonight. The Democratic nominee for U.S. Senate is Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester of Wilmington, Delaware. Representative Blunt Rochester declined to participate in our debate and is not here. In the interest of public service, we're proceeding with our discussion with Mr. Hansen. The University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication highly values offering Delaware voters a face-to-face discussion of vital public issues among the candidates for high national elective office. We consider debates like this one among the historically important traditions of democracy. Voters get a chance to see candidates in structured, dignified discussion of the issues before the ballots are cast. The University of Delaware, the state's flagship institution, undertakes this task in election years as a civic responsibility to the state in support of civil public dialogue. Mr. Hansen, welcome to the University of Delaware and to Delaware Debates. We appreciate your participation.
Thank you, Mr. Begleiter.
Mr. Hansen has agreed in advance to rules for this program, including holding his responses to specific time limits. We also have some questions posed by a student, Senior Casey Nyman, executive producer for Student Television Network here at UD. Although the candidate has agreed there will be no opening statements, you will hear his closing statement later. We'll try to keep our questions concise and ask the candidate to answer succinctly so that we can cover as much ground as possible. Let's focus first, Mr. Hansen, on what I think is the issue that is topmost on the minds of most of the voters in the country, and that is the economy. Even though national data on jobs, inflation, sales, production all show the economy is in good shape, I want to ask you what steps you would take, if elected, to make voters feel better about the national economy.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is the most important thing that we can really talk about because, and I grew up poor, so I really do understand the impact that this is having on a lot of people right now. The cost of living in Delaware is simply too high. Cost of food, rent, housing, utilities, the list goes on healthcare, and it's just too much for too many families here. The economy is broken for too many of these families, and we still have in Delaware 60% of households living paycheck to paycheck. And we spend as a government more than we have. It's a problem. We have a spending problem in the US, and Congress spends like it's not their money and that they're just trying to get reelected, which is probably largely the case. And as a country, we waste about $1 trillion a year. So imagine if we spent that $1 trillion on programs that didn't waste the money, but on things that really helped us all live better lives. And that's ultimately what we have to do. I think in the short term, we have an immediate problem as well, which is we need immediate relief for some of these families that are really struggling with the high inflation that we have now. So I would push for a tax relief on working families, and middle-class working families, and also a temporary tax pause on families making less than $50,000 a year. In contrast, my opponent has really voted against the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and voted for over $1 trillion in additional spending increases, which really led to this high inflation and this high cost of living for so many working families. So I will not rest until we have balanced budgets in this country, smarter spending, and until we can stimulate the economy for more jobs and lower cost of living and lower inflation. That ultimately is the solution.
A moment ago, you talked about they, meaning Congress, sometimes spends on things that you'd prefer they didn't spend on. And I think elected officials and candidates talk a lot about cutting spending. So please list a few specific things in the federal budget that as a United States Senator, you would vote to cut when you're in Congress.
Yeah, so my plan is called the Hansen Spend and Tax Reduction Act, and the idea is to reduce the amount of government spend by a small amount, 2% per year, and just force all of the government to get slightly more efficient. Now, some of that will just happen through natural attrition, people leaving, but some of it will be forcing the agencies in the government to get more efficient. Now, there's a lot of inefficiencies out there. There's a lot of waste. Let me give you just one example. So Medicare right now is prohibited from allowing patients to go to outpatient facilities for many procedures. What that means is they have to go to expensive hospitals instead of less expensive and just as good outpatient clinics. If we change that rule, we could save almost $1 trillion over 10 years. That's not an insignificant amount of time. That's a small rule that improves healthcare outcomes potentially, improves delivery of services to patients, and improves the way we spend our money. So it's those kinds of things that we need to look at seriously to make the government spend smarter.
So you said 2%, I think you said, cut across the board. That would be across the board. So you'd be cutting military spending, veteran spending, Social Security, every kind of spending that the federal government is involved in, you would advocate cutting by 2%.
It's certainly easy with the non-entitlement programs to do that, and they should do that unquestionably. Even the entitlement programs, in some cases, like I just described with Medicare, there's opportunities to do some cutting. Now, with military, I think that's another conversation that we need to have, because having a strong military, I think, is critical to the safety and security of this country and, frankly, the world. But what the goal is just to make the government run more efficiently. In the private sector, companies have to get a little bit better every year or they just don't succeed long term. The government should do the same thing.
Let me turn now to my colleague Casey Nyman, a UD senior here at the Student Television Network, for our next question. Casey?
Thank you, Ralph, and hello, Mr. Hansen. Many young people in the United States have voiced their skepticism about their futures, especially compared to their parents and grandparents. It seems that the American dream is no longer something that's tangible. What do you think Congress should do to reassure young Americans about the prospects of their future?
Yeah, I've traveled all up and down the state, and I hear this pretty regularly. I hear parents saying they don't feel like the American dream is as relevant or attainable for their kids as it was for them. So they're worried about the future of their children. And the children are worried that they aren't going to have as good a life as their parents. What they're seeing is high cost of living right now. They're seeing really high housing prices. I'm hearing story after story of kids who are having a hard time moving out of their parents' house because they just can't afford to do it. Interest rates are too high. Inflation is too high. Housing prices are too high. The cost of housing in Delaware has increased almost $100,000 for the average house in the last 2 years. That makes housing unattainable for too many people here in Delaware. So what we need to do is, back to what I said before, we have to lower the cost of living, and we have to lower the inflation rate and the interest rate. All of these things will allow people to have a much more successful life here in the US. It's really about setting ourselves up for success. Now, that said, there are things like generational wealth that we need to promote as well. If you own a business or if you own a house, you are much more set up for generational wealth and for generational wealth attainment than you would be without. So we need to make sure we have programs that help people start their own business and buy their first houses and buy their first homes. I think those are critically important too. Again, getting back to achieving this American dream that we all aspire to.
I want to piggyback a little on Casey's question and broaden it a little bit beyond her question and your answer. I think when young people look around them, they see a planet that is being ravaged by climate change, about which very little is actually being done. They see the Supreme Court stripping them of their personal rights on reproduction. They see those regulations being sent to the states. They worry about home ownership, which you mentioned, student debt, the cost of raising a family. Some of them think about retirement security, even though they're young at this point. They see themselves paying for my retirement while they're not sure that they're going to have theirs when the time comes. So my question to you is, what should Congress do to assure young people that the institutions of our government are actually going to have their backs over coming decades? And I'm not talking about what could be done next year or whatever, but it's an institutional question, I think.
Yeah, it is. So, and there's a lot to unpack there. Let me start with some of the pieces that you talked about. The Supreme Court. Right now, the Supreme Court is a critical piece of the checks and balances of the federal government. And the American people have lost some trust in the Supreme Court. So what I'd like to do is push for the Hansen Supreme Court Ethics and Integrity Act, which will restore confidence in the Supreme Court and hold them all to the same standard, high ethical standards that we expect from them. Those kinds of things. Term limits, to me. Term limits are critically important, and it's a way to get, it's something that I've already committed to publicly, but it's a way to get fresh blood and fresh thinking into the government. A lot of people, right now, 75% of people disapprove of the work of the federal government, and especially the Congress. So there's a disapproval rating of 75%. That's unacceptable. We need to give people faith that the federal government and Congress is going to work on their behalf. I think term limits is a critically important piece of that. So again, I've said on the record I agree to term limits. I think term limits brings in fresh blood, fresh ideas, and term limits allows politicians to vote for what's right and not what's going to get them reelected. There are too many politicians now who all they care about is making sure they're not getting embarrassed, they're not leading, they're not being bold, they're worried about their vote coming back to haunt them. Term limits solves this. So there's a number of issues that we can help solve to give people confidence back in the government.
You would vote for term limits on your own term in the Senate if you were elected?
Absolutely. I've said on the record that I will run for a single term only, and only if the majority of Delawareans think I did a fantastic job would I run for a second term. I think it's necessary for me and for everyone in Congress. It frees me, again, to vote the right way, to vote for what's right for the people in Delaware and not what's going to get me reelected. I shouldn't be concerned about being reelected at all, nor should anyone in Congress.
All right, our next question comes again from UD student television executive producer Casey Nyman. Casey?
Mr. Hansen, how do you feel about a national ban on abortion? And do you think in Congress you would vote to reverse the Supreme Court's ruling for a woman's right to have an abortion? And are there any limitations you would vote on as a device to stop states from imposing a greater ban on abortion?
It's a really important question, Casey, thank you. And when the Supreme Court through Dobbs, handed the decision back to the states about abortion, Delaware was very clear where it stood. And as your next U.S. Senator, I would be remiss and it would be inappropriate for me to overrule the will of the people of Delaware and vote for a federal abortion ban. So to be very clear, I, as U.S. Senator, will not vote for a federal abortion ban, full stop. Now, that said, I do think we need to do more to support women. I think it would be great to have more support for maternal care, more support for prenatal care. We need to make sure that we have better maternal outcomes, especially for some groups that have less than average outcomes. And frankly, healthcare costs for maternal care and for other costs need to be addressed as well. But ultimately, this decision rests with the state, and I appreciate that.
Would you vote for or advocate restoring Roe v. Wade?
So I think what's really good about the decision in Dobbs to push it back to the state is it sparks a really good dialogue. And in this case, Delaware, again, has made it very clear where they stand on the issue. And I don't think it's right for me to overrule that. I think it's good that we continue as a state to have these discussions.
All right, I'd like to throw our attention to another major national issue that's on a lot of voters' minds, and that's immigration policy. Mm-hmm. Early this year, Congress almost passed a new immigration bill with support of a majority both among Democrats and Republicans in both the House and the Senate. But it died when President Trump signaled Republicans to vote against it during the election year. If it's revived in the next Congress, where you could be a member, will you vote to approve that legislation?
So the answer to your question is yes, I would vote for the bipartisan border reform bill, but I think we should think about that as a stopgap measure, and more needs to be done. So the way I think about immigration is very simple. We have legal immigration, which we should fully support, and I fully support. And then we have illegal immigration, which we need to stop. And for those who came here legally, I applaud their effort. It's a hard thing to do, to come to this United States of America and do all the work. It's a long and tedious process to get here. And I think the people who did it the right way should be really appreciated. For those who did it the wrong way, what we need to do is make sure that we are not giving them a free ride. So what we need to do is the bipartisan border reform bill is great, but we need to do asylum reform as well. Right now, there are just too many loopholes. People come across the border, they claim asylum, and basically we release them into the country with a 2 or 3 year court date. They may or may not show up, but they're here forever. We've got 11 million people in this country illegally. We've got 600,000 coming in each year. It's unsustainable. And the problem ultimately is we just can't and don't vet these people well enough. So what I think is really necessary is more vetting to make sure that we're letting in the right people. Having skills-based legal immigration, fantastic. Having more vetting, fantastic. Making sure that the drug dealers are not coming in, the gang members are not coming in, the terrorists are not coming in. That's the vetting that we desperately need to make sure that we're getting in the right people and not the wrong people.
You've said that if the Border Reform Act were proposed again, you would vote for it if you're elected. Regardless of whether he's in or out of office, if President Trump signaled you as a member of your party, of his party, not to vote for it, would you follow his instructions?
So, absolutely not. My job is to vote in a way that benefits the people of Delaware and the people of this country. And I would not vote in any way that does not do that. If the right thing is to vote for that bipartisan border bill or any bill that benefits the state or the country, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to cross the aisle to make sure that I get the right bills across. I am going to work with the other party as necessary. I will collaborate. I'm going to do the right thing for Delaware and the country, regardless of the political implications. And again, back to term limits. Agreeing to only one term helps me do those right votes to the right things for Delaware and the nation.
Let's turn to international affairs for a couple of minutes. We won't cover everything, but I want to ask you about the war in Ukraine and ask you whether you think the United States and its allies should continue funding, training, and sending weapons to the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian military to fight against the invasion by the Russians.
So Vladimir Putin is a bully, and if he has his way, he will continue his bad behavior and his expansions that he's tried in Ukraine. We need to push back on him. That said, we, the United States, have done more than our fair share in Ukraine right now. And the right solution is to have NATO step up and start doing their fair share. They need to do more of the heavy lifting. We've done enough. They need to do more. Now, it may require us to do some additional investing in Ukraine, but those dollars should be tied directly to NATO dollars as well. And again, NATO has to do more. NATO hasn't done enough to date. So yes, we need to push back on Putin. Yes, we need to push back on Russian invasion and Russian ill intent, but we've done enough for the most part, and it's time for others to pick up the slack.
Sticking with global issues, I want to preface by just saying the Middle East is a very complicated place, and so we won't spend enough time on that. But considering the ongoing Gaza war begun by Hamas last year, and the Second Front War with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and now tensions with Iran over its role in the fighting, what role do you think the U.S. Congress should play in coming months with regard to the situation in the Middle East?
Yeah, so the way I think about the Middle East, Israel is our strongest ally in the Middle East and maybe arguably our only ally. And Israel absolutely has the right to exist and absolutely has the right to defend itself. And on October 7th, Hamas did a horrific attack on Israel and killed roughly 1,200 people and captured over 200 people as hostages. I strongly support Israel's right to defend itself, and I think some of what Israel is doing with our help, for example, the Iron Dome has been a wonderful defensive mechanism to keep rockets from coming and causing further damage. So I herald what they're doing wonderfully in their defensive nature. I think we all should be concerned about some of the innocents that are getting caught up in this conflict. And what we have to understand is this conflict is not just between Hamas and Israel. The conflict isn't between Israel and Hezbollah. The conflict really is Iran creating regional conflict in an effort to destabilize the region and win political points and win power in the region. This is Iran with its proxies destabilizing the region. So I think we really have to pay attention to Iran as the instigator of this, and we as the United States need to do more to push back on Iran and their bad behavior as well.
There are people who say the United States spends too much money on the Middle East, too much aid to allies and friends in the Middle East, for example. Do you think Congress should use its power of the purse to either increase or reduce funding for U.S. allies in the region or to impose sanctions on parties to the conflict?
So sanctions, yes, and for example, the the Houthis. So my opponent voted against declaring Houthis as a global terrorist organization. I would have voted yes. Department of Homeland Security on January 17th, I believe, declared them a global terrorist. And as a result, we're putting sanctions on them. That's exactly the right kind of methodology we should use. Sanctions on Iran started to really work. The problem is we applied sanctions, and then we also gave them aid, and money is fungible. It didn't work as well as it needs to. So continuing sanctions and harder sanctions on Iran, absolutely the right thing. On the Houthis, yes. On other terrorist organizations, absolutely yes. But helping our ally in the Middle East, Israel, with their defense, I think still makes sense as well.
Switching gears now to some other national issues on many voters' minds related to civil rights. I'm going to turn to UD student television journalist Casey Nyman again, who has some questions in this area. Casey?
Yes, switching topics a little bit, do you think that federal law should protect or prohibit an individual's right to specify their gender in places like school sports, bathrooms, or healthcare? Or do you think this should be up to the states to decide?
Yeah, so the first thing I will say is with respect to gender issues, I think everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. And I think that these are decisions that are really left between parents and children when children are involved, and the federal government shouldn't be involved at all. I think the federal government shouldn't be telling really anyone, as long as they're not hurting others, the federal government shouldn't be telling anyone what they should be doing or how they should be thinking. So I think ultimately this is not a state issue as much as, or even a federal issue, and these are situations that require more discussion, but I do want to appreciate and acknowledge that some of the rhetoric has gotten too divisive here, and we need to be kinder to our citizens.
So you're saying neither the federal government nor the states should intervene in these issues?
Well, so I think what needs to happen is we need to have principles that everyone feels. We need to have discussions and then a principle-based discussion. So let me give you an example. Right now, I have a daughter who plays sports. I want to make sure that she has a level playing field. And so I don't want to put her in any physical risk, when she's playing sports. And so to me, a temporary, reasonable solution, common sense solution that works until we have a better one would be to say, let's have girls' sports, let's have boys' sports, and let's have everyone's sports. And that potentially solves the issue until we can have that more robust discussion to figure out whether there's a better solution.
Okay, I interrupted. Sorry, Casey, you had another question.
No, yeah, there's been a lot of buzz during this election season about the spread of misinformation and false information. Do you think that social media companies like Instagram, Facebook, X, Google, and others should be held accountable for the information spread on these platforms, or does this go against First Amendment rights? And if so, what would this accountability look like?
Yeah, it's a very tough question because we need to protect First Amendment rights at all costs. And when the founders put together the First Amendment and our freedom of speech, they couldn't have imagined that our town square would evolve into social media networks where anyone can say anything and it can be amplified and put in echo chambers. So. But at the same time, we do need to protect our freedom of speech. So the way I would think about this is it is up to the platforms to reasonably police in the same way. I would think about it in the same way that you would think about someone walking into a movie theater and screaming fire. That puts others at risk intentionally. And there's laws against that. On the other hand, saying something that people don't like is fully protected by the Constitution. You can say some just terrible things and you're protected by the First Amendment. The same kind of rules should apply online as well. We should make sure that the platforms keep any malicious things that cause threats or violence, but at the same time we should, and it's a necessary part of our democracy, allow free speech. It's a really complex question, but right now, social media, I think what we really need to do is stand back and have a really robust discussion and framework that allows us to talk about how do we protect First Amendment rights, how do we protect privacy rights, and how do we keep our children from some of the harms that they're having right now on sites like Instagram and TikTok, which are harming our youth? How do we deal with all this? It's worth a really complex discussion that right now the government's just not prepared to have.
So, sorry, but just to follow up, you are suggesting that the misinformation that Casey asked about, essentially for the moment, that should continue because that would not fall into the categories you mentioned.
True, but let me caveat that with, I think there's been some really great developments on crowdsourced misinformation identification. So I think that's fantastic. Let the crowd start to identify when there's misinformation, and let the crowd start to tell the world that this is false information. And let's also teach people how to separate misinformation from real information and how to look at issues objectively and look at both sides so they can create a broader view that understands that views aren't always as simple as there's typically not a black and white solution to any given issue. And so to understand that there's lots of ways to look at an issue is critical to the way we think about this. But I think that this idea of crowdsourced verification is a wonderful idea, and we need to keep pursuing.
Back to Casey Nyman for another question on a national issue.
Mr. Hansen, you have children, so I'm sure what I'm about to say they know all too well too. But since my earliest memories in school, we've been practicing active shooter drills or what to do if there's an intruder. What do you think should be done about the pattern of gun violence in America?
Yeah, it's a really important question, Casey. And I think what we need to keep in mind and remember is the vast majority of violent crimes, including gun crimes, are committed by repeat violent offenders. Again, that's critically important. I'm going to say it again. Repeat violent offenders are committing the vast majority of these violent crimes. And as I've gone up and down the state, I've talked to lots of police officers, and what they say consistently is there's a small group of people in every community that are committing these violent crimes. We know who they are for the most part. We arrest them, and before we're done with the paperwork, they're back out on the street. It's a catch and release. And so what we're having here in the state is a bit of a problem of not prosecuting the violent criminals and not keeping them off the streets. If that's the case, if the state isn't going to do the work to prosecute the violent criminals and keep them off the street, then I would bring in a federal task force that would prosecute those violent criminals, and because in many cases those crimes are both state and federal crimes, so prosecute them federally, put them in federal prison, get them off the streets, and then reduce the crime and increase the safety across the board for all of us, for every community. So I think ultimately that's the solution, is do what's necessary to keep those violent criminals and keep the guns out of the hands of the violent criminals. That will do massive improvements for community safety.
So federal prosecutors, a task force of federal prosecutors to deal with violent crimes in the states. Are there other areas of enforcement where the same kind of federal prosecutors task force you think should or should not be used? For example, should federal prosecutors or other law enforcement agents be involved in voting rights, protecting voting rights, or I don't know, enforcing abortion laws? So if the states aren't doing it, you said bring in the feds.
Yeah. So
what other areas would that apply to?
Yeah, so there are plenty of agencies who can deal with the kind of issues that you're talking about. What I'm talking about specifically are repeat violent criminals. And what really that covers is murder, drug distribution and trafficking, gang-related crimes, attempted murder, and then serious domestic abuse cases. And so really that's what I'm talking about specifically, is those are the ones, and really more on the front end of that. It's the murder, it's the gang cases, it's the drug cases, it's violent robberies. Those are the cases that really we need a federal task force to intervene. In general, I don't love the idea of the federal agencies taking power when the states could control it. In this case, the states aren't controlling it well, so the federal government should get involved.
I can't help following up again on something like voting rights. If the states aren't enforcing the law on voting rights, you would say, no, don't send in the feds on that? Or
So I don't know of a case where that's happening. And if that's the case, I would certainly hope that the state can take care of it. If the state couldn't, then yes, the federal government is always a backstop to the state. If the state can't do anything that they need to legally, the federal government is there to be that backstop.
Okay. I wanted to ask you a question about other kinds of regulatory enforcement. There was a decision, which I won't refer to by its name because nobody knows what it is. The Supreme Court made a decision that essentially prevents federal government agencies from making sorts of regulatory decisions in areas like consumer safety and regulation of, let's say, the oil industry or electric power generation or whatever. And the Supreme Court said, no, these agencies can't make that decision. Those decisions should be made by judges in the courts. I wanted to ask you what you feel about those kinds of things and about that Supreme Court decision.
Yeah, I have honestly very mixed emotions about that decision. And the reason why is that the agencies, and typically the federal agencies, are supposed to be subject matter experts. And so they should know a lot. Now, the problem is that they don't necessarily have the control to have public input to everything that they do. And so sometimes they make decisions that politicians or we, the public, don't always love. And so I understand the idea of taking some of that power away from them and giving it to the legislative branch so it can be legislated by peers and by the legislature, the judicial branch of the government, so that we have more interaction with those choices. The problem is the judiciary are not experts in some of these policy decision areas. So I understand the motivation of trying to pull it out into the judicial sector, and I understand the need to keep it in the executive branch and allow the regulation to come from the subject matter experts. I think there's probably a happy ground between those two. I don't know exactly how to solve for that right now in terms of the legislation, and it requires a little bit more effort. But I understand both sides, and I struggle a bit with this one.
But you would revisit the Supreme Court decision if you were in Congress. You'd say, we have to do something else about this.
Well, so ultimately, the Supreme Court made it essentially set precedent in the law that a lot of these regulatory decisions are going to be pushed to the courts. I think we're going to see over the next couple of years that becomes either really a great thing and very efficient, or terribly inefficient and causes a bunch of chaos. If it's the latter, I think it's the Congress's duty to say, you know what, we have to revisit this, and we're going to create a new law that you, the Supreme Court, will then essentially have to abide by.
I'd like to ask you now about something the state of Delaware has been debating, and I know you've been paying attention to it, of course, as well. Here in Delaware, the legislature passed, but the governor vetoed, a bill giving people with terminal or incurable diseases the right to choose when they die. Would you support national legislation like the one that has been proposed and vetoed in Delaware, guaranteeing a national right to die?
So I think it's really interesting. The governor vetoed that right to die on September 24th, so very recently. I think that was actually a good decision, and I think it's a good decision just because we need to have more discussion, and we need to have more of an ethical and legal framework and principles around the way that we think about this issue. And we rushed as a state legislature into a piece of legislation very quickly that I don't think we had enough time to really get the public input to understand what the implications are. So I think it's actually a good thing that we have a bit of pause to step back and say, let's think about this issue more critically and think about some of the challenges that we might have. I've heard stories and concerns about people who worry that this bill and this right to die bill might be misused, and we absolutely don't want that to happen. So I think it's a wonderful pause that we as a state talk about this more, and that we as a nation have the discussion as well.
We touched on this issue a little bit earlier. You touched on it in your earliest comments, but I'd like to revisit the housing crisis in the United States. It's especially the case for young home buyers, but there's also a homeless issue involved here, low-income home buyers. We've reached a point where people can't buy a relatively inexpensive home and can't progress from renting to buying, and you earlier mentioned the need to build equity so you can build wealth for your family and so on and so forth. My question for you now is, should Congress step in to do something about this, and if so, what should be done? Or is this one of those things that you would say, no, this should be left for the states? So
the answer is yes to both. So The reality is we've got a supply issue here in Delaware, and frankly across the country, but especially in Delaware. We've got a supply issue. We've got plenty of demand for low-income housing, and we just don't have enough supply. I've talked to builders all up and down the state, and their stories are consistently the same. It's an 18 to 24-month permitting process. Interest rates are high, not just for the buyers, but for the builders as well. The regulations are getting complex and burdensome, and the builders keep saying consistently, I'm having a hard time getting affordable housing that's profitable for me. I can't do it and make any money. What I can make money on is building expensive houses. So what you see is expensive houses being built all over this state and the affordable housing getting left behind. So what we have to do as a state is make it easier for these builders to build affordable housing. That means getting rid of some of the regulations, opening up, reducing the permitting window and making that shorter. And then as a nation, I think the idea of having first-time homeowners tax credits is a wonderful thing. It's back to the generational wealth that we just talked about. It's a wonderful thing to do that. So I think the federal government can incent on the cost side, but the reality is, again, cost is not the primary driver here. The cost of housing is so expensive right now, and we don't have affordable options. So until we figure the supply issue out, which is largely a state issue, then the federal government giving small tax breaks for people to buy housing isn't going to ultimately solve this situation.
So you don't see a role for the U.S. Senate, for example, in incentivizing the states to change their rules, change their regulations in order to create more affordable housing?
There's always a role for the U.S. Senate to influence the state, and I think that's fantastic. Now, the U.S. Senate they can pass laws that affect the entire country. They can't pass laws specifically for Delaware, but what I can do is I can talk to all of our legislators here in the state and say, I'd really like us to move this direction. I can use the power of the office to help us move that direction. I can use the influence and some of the federal purse strings to help us move that direction, and that is the kind of influence that we do need from the federal government.
All right. I want to ask you about another issue that is specific to Delaware, but it has similar implications elsewhere in the country. Do you favor construction of the federally approved wind farm off the coast of Delaware with its wires coming ashore in Delaware?
So the answer is no, and let me tell you why. We in this country have a tendency to move towards regulation and mandates, and this is true for Delaware as well, instead of innovation. And innovation in energy has given us 100 years of natural gas, which has allowed us to move away from dirtier energies into natural gas and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. Fantastic. Innovation has allowed us to reduce the cost of solar dramatically, and the cost of solar keeps declining precipitously. And the cost of solar is now below wind, and the cost of solar is expected to keep declining, whereas wind power has basically plateaued. So the challenge with wind is, in addition to the fact that I don't love wind power being off our beautiful, pristine beaches, and I don't love the power coming inland into the bay or onto Fenwick Island, the problem with wind is it's just not as affordable as alternatives like solar, and solar will keep being more affordable. So to me, the answer is not that we shouldn't try and get better energy sources. The question is which energy sources, and are they the right choice? Solar is a fantastic choice. My one problem with solar is that China makes all the solar panels, and we should be making them here in the US. So we shouldn't be outsourcing all of this great green technology to China. We should be insourcing it to the US.
You didn't mention the phrase climate change at all in your response. Do you see decisions like the one on the wind situation as being related to doing something about climate change?
So the interesting thing about that is what China and India are doing right now by increasing the number of coal-fired plants that they're producing and that they're building every single year negates anything that the US does right now. So no matter what we do to try and reduce greenhouse gases or try and improve global warming is irrelevant based upon what China and India are doing with coal-fired plants. So what do we do about that? What we need to have is very selective tariffs on products that use high amounts of energy that China and India are using coal-fired plants for. So for example, aluminum, steel, glass. These are the products that we're currently getting from India and China that are using a huge amount of coal, dirty, dirty coal. So if we have disincentives for them to use coal and incentives for them to start using greener energy, then we benefit, and all the things that we can do here in the US start to matter in a way that they just don't right now because of China and India.
We're coming to the end of our time. I want to ask one more question. It's a short one. I hope you'll keep a concise answer on this one.
Sure.
Should the federal government authorize offshore oil drilling off the coast of Delaware?
So I don't love offshore oil drilling off the coast of Delaware for a number of reasons that would be self-explanatory or completely understandable. However, what I really do like, I love the fact that the United States has moved from energy dependent back in the 70s and OPEC. We were beholden to OPEC back then, and we paid a price for a while where we had gas shocks and recessions because of what happened with our dependence on OPEC oil. We've gotten to the point where we're energy independent now, which is fantastic. What I would love to see happen is the United States move to an energy exporter. And when I say that, I mean things like clean liquid natural gas that could be sent over to other places in the world that are using coal right now. So wouldn't it be fantastic if the United States were an energy exporter and continued to leverage the oil that we have, but still transitioning to greener, cleaner energy in the process? Geothermal, a great prospect for the future. Solar, a great prospect for the future. We have small modular nuclear are getting safer and less expensive. There's so many options that we have, and I'd love us to pursue them. I don't love, frankly, offshore drilling off the coast of Delaware because we have such a wonderful state, such pristine beaches, such wonderful farmland. I would hate to ruin any of what we have here. It's such a great state.
As we conclude our time together in this program, I want to be sure to give you an opportunity to address voters with your closing thoughts. If you would, please limit it to 1 minute.
Absolutely. So thank you all for coming. Again, my name is Eric Hansen, running for U.S. Senate. Let me just say that I am not a politician. I'm running because I love Delaware, because Delaware has tremendous unrealized potential, because Delaware deserves better from D.C., because the cost of living is crushing Delaware families right now, and all this under my opponent's watch. She voted against middle-class tax increases, middle-class tax cuts. She voted for trillions that sent inflation through the roof, and Delaware families are now paying thousands more as a result. In business, I saved Americans about $25 billion. In the Senate, I will do exactly the same. I'll reduce the cost of living. I'll reduce inflation. If you want the cost of living reduced, I think I'm the only reasonable candidate. I will lower taxes. I'll reduce the cost of living. I'll stop violent crime. I'll fix the border. I'll work with everyone, as I've done before successfully, to get the results that we all need and that we all deserve better here in Delaware. So thank you all, and thank you all for your votes.
Eric Hansen, thank you very much for participating in Delaware Debates 2024. On behalf of the Delaware Public Media and the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication, thank you all for watching Delaware Debates. I'm Ralph Begleiter, encouraging you to cast your ballot by Tuesday, November 5th. Thank you.